Yeah, I know. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Adventist Today community, for coming together for this presentation. This is one of those topics that can win you friends and can make enemies as well. But that's not new to some of us, so I am going to take the plunge here. Let me begin by a confession. Intellect is the ability to avoid belaboring the obvious. I am going to belabor the obvious today, at least something that's obvious to many of us, probably all of us. And I'm going to do that to kind of set the table for this conversation. We just need to remind ourselves of some of the stuff that are obvious to, at least to some of us, and seem to miss many in their thinking. So that's where I'm going to begin. Hopefully that's not where we will end. So Adventism, like every religion, has evolved, has changed, and is interpreted and reinterpreted by believers. That might be a threatening idea to some, but it is a pretty refreshing idea to others. The ability to interpret and reinterpret the faith as we mature, as time goes on. So that's one of the realities, and I think you will quickly see that that is the case. Another reality is that all religions are internally diverse. You know, we kind of think of the various religions and the differences, but even within each religion, there is much diversity. And Adventists are no different. We are an increasingly diverse community. And our diversity shows up in many, many ways. But in the context of our conversation here today, I just want to highlight the fact that we are diverse in how we view the church and the organizational structure. We are diverse in how we see it, how we relate to it, how much we value it, and we'll try to spell that out here a little more. Now, one of the perspectives that we have is that the Adventist organizational structure has expanded beyond its usefulness and effectiveness. Now, this in some ways is belaboring the obvious to some of us, that we have become top-heavy in many ways, and that is a problem. And while there are some who find the structure to be serving them well, many are convinced that many roles and functions have become ineffective and unnecessary. So the structure as we have it has some positives as some see it. It gives congregations a sort of a brand identity. It gives us names and beliefs that we can embrace. It gives us a sense of being a sisterhood of churches around the world, which obviously many value. And Adventists around the world seem to identify with elements of one single story. Now, they may identify with different aspects of that story, but at the core, there is a story that we all identify with. And different elements of it seem to speak to us in different ways. And so the structure seems to be able to provide this for us. Something else that we appreciate, or many appreciate, and that is that the structure is able to strategically allocate pooled resources. I think our history has shown that, went too far here quickly. Our history has shown that we have been able to deploy resources to expand the church's presence in various parts of the world. That's a strategic decision that we've been able to make and say, here's a part of the world where we don't have a presence. Maybe we should. How do we go about making that happen? The structure has also enabled us to build institutions, some of which at least have played a significant role in expanding the mission. There are places in the world where the institution, maybe a school, a college, maybe a clinic, maybe a hospital, these have been the ways in which the church has kind of taken root and how the mission has expanded. Now, there might be some debate about this one, but when you're on the inside of this, you see how valuable it is to be able to know who's who and where they are, especially when you're trying to staff your churches or your institutions. The connectional system of the church gives us the ability to kind of track who's who and where they are. Now, this is not a foolproof mechanism, to be sure, but it is there nevertheless. Now, besides how the structure may have influenced the expansion of the church, many Adventists also appreciate how the church has blessed them and played a role in their faith formation. Some of us, many of us, first heard the story of Jesus in the church or through parents who were in the church. And that story has become critically important, central to our faith development. So in that sense, the church has been a blessing. And now, again, that's not to say that we could not have heard the story of Jesus elsewhere. But certainly the church has played a significant role in telling us the story of Jesus. Something else that many Adventists value, and that is the lifelong relationships that have been formed through engagement with the church, maybe from Sabbath school, maybe from an elementary school or from college, relationships that have lasted a lifetime. Another gift, as it were, from the church. Some have found that the congregations that they've been connected with have supported their own faith journey. And not every congregation is supportive, of course, but many have found in their congregations a supportive community that has journeyed with them in life. The church also gives us a religious identity, and that's one of the things that religions do. They give us an identity, right? And we have embraced a certain identity that has come to us from the church. No doubt education has benefited many of us in the church. I think you know the history that within about 8 or 9 years after Adventism formally organized in 1863, in about 9 years, we established our first school. And a couple of years later, our first college. Very, very, very early in our history, in our story, we saw the value of education and invested in it. And many of us have benefited from that. And some of us have even benefited by being employed in some aspect of the church, either in a congregation, in an educational institution, or wherever it might be. So the church has had some positives in terms of mission expansion, etc., and also in the life of individuals. And I thought it would be interesting to kind of compare the Adventist journey with some of the other churches that came into being about the same time in the 19th century. And my apologies to those of you who might have been at the Asheville forum here a few weeks ago when I shared some of this. Some of it is a repeat of what I said there. So the Protestant denominations that were established in the 19th century, just look at the statistics here. I get these numbers from their own websites, at least many of them. Advent Christian Church, about 25,000 members in the US and about 100,000 internationally. The Church of God Holiness, they don't give a number of members, 120 congregations in the USA. The Christian Reformed Church in North America, about 204,000 members. The Reformed Episcopal Church, 13,600 members. These are churches that were born in the 19th century. Church of God Seventh Day, 14,000 members in the USA, a larger number internationally. Jehovah's Witnesses claim 8.5 million, and the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, 16.8 million. So this seems to be the trajectory, the story of churches that were born in the 19th century. Let's look at ourselves then. If I can get this thing to move. What happened here? Here it is. Okay, so the Adventist Church, as of the end of 2021, 95,000 churches and 72,000 companies. Companies are congregations that haven't formally been classified as churches. So between the two, 168,000 congregations around the world, 20,000 ordained ministers, 322,000 employees, that is church, education, etc. 21,900,000 members as of the end of 2021. 21 million. Significantly larger than just about every other denomination that came into being in the 19th century. Now, just to put this in context, I checked the world population clock last night at 9:42 p.m. and the population of the world at that moment was 8,028,908,000. And the population growth until 9:42 p.m. last night for this year was 20 million. Just a little shy of the 21 million membership of the Adventist Church. So when you look at the global context, you see that we are just a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the population of the world. We claim to be present in 212 countries and have ministry in 535 languages, 9,000 some schools, 2 million students enrolled at the end of 2021, 229 hospitals, 57 publishing houses. ADRA is present in 130 countries. We have 18 media centers. And last year, in summer of last year, the General Conference treasurer in his report said that in 1863, when we were organized, that we received a total tithe of $8,000, which in today's currency would be 191,000. And the end of 2021, that we received $2.7 billion in tithe, 1 billion in local church offerings, 81 million in world mission offerings. Now, these numbers are much, much larger than what I have in my bank account. These are numbers that I don't deal with, but they are big numbers, $2.7 billion in tithe. So these are the statistics as compared to churches that came into being about the same time. Now, some would say, but these are impressive statistics. These are good results. So what's the problem, right? What's the problem? What is the concern if the church appears to have been this successful in expansion, in growth? Now, again, I'm going to belabor the obvious, and so please hang in there with me. You know much of some of what I'm going to say here. Some of the reasons for the concern about the structure, right? The hierarchical structure with many layers is the amount of resources that are used up to keep it going. Resources in terms of money, resources in terms of personnel. That's one concern. And we won't go into the weeds with that. And also the idea of redundancy, that at each level, some of the same ministries are performed, and so there's so much redundancy. So when you look at the number of units that make up the structure, you can see that it's a pretty large number of units that make up the structure. And so when you're talking about resource utilization, when you're talking about redundancy, and you see these things being repeated in all of these levels, you can quickly see how that can be a concern, and is a concern. Other issues about the structure. The hankering for uniformity. And I think we, in recent years at least, have sensed how much of an effort is being done from the General Conference down to in the name of unity, to try to bring about uniformity. The inability to adapt to local contexts and local needs. Being heavily program-centric, and the ability to push down programs. It seems like almost every year there's a new campaign of some sort coming out with a new slogan. The issues of relevance and control, and how difficult it is for us to embrace change. All of these are reasons for concern that people have about the structure itself. Now, for more than 4 decades, there have been calls for restructuring, for downsizing, but we have not seen appreciable change. A reader of Adventist Today, after the last magazine was published, wrote in a letter and said that her dad, who retired in 1992, had sent a letter to the pastors in the conference where he served, and to the union and the division, urging restructuring. This is 1992. 31 years have gone since then. At least for 4 decades or more, there have been calls, but we have not seen appreciable restructuring. And it has not been because we have not had any viable models, right? One models proposed by several have been to consolidate the conferences, the roles and functions, knowing that there's a lot of redundancy. in the roles and functions. Lauren mentioned what we attempted to do here in Ohio. We proposed a model where the 8 conferences in this union could consolidate into one unit and still offer services that were needed. And but that was almost dead on arrival. As a way of saying we'll go first, we had our committee vote to disband our conference if the others would go along with this and implement the model. So there have been models like that. There have been models that have said we don't need the unions. And there are arguments for pro and con. The idea of a centralized payroll for regions, larger organizations than the church have centralized payroll services. There have been models of saying, no, we don't need all of these departments. We can outsource the services we need. A very creative model was that we identified teaching churches instead of having all the departments in these churches, in the conferences and the unions. If there was a church that was doing, say, children's ministries really well, we just highlight that church. And if somebody wants to learn how to do children's ministries, you connect them with that church where they're doing it in the front lines. There are practitioners. So there have been all kinds of models that have been proposed, but obviously not much traction has taken place. Now, to be fair, we've got to say that all bureaucracies in general resist change, not just the church. Bureaucracies are tough to change. Why? Because they seem to work, at least to some degree. They seem to work. They have clear lines of authority. They have standardized tasks. They offer a comfortable familiarity. So there are things that seem to keep bureaucracies going on and on and on. So what we are talking about in the church is not unique to the church. It's something that bureaucracies in general seem to have trouble with. Now, why hasn't substantive change happened? And I'm going to step out here and propose a couple of things that I think has kept us from embracing change, substantive change. And I want to first look at the General Conference policy book, which has some 840 some pages. I'm going to read a few paragraphs from what's called the B75 policy. Okay, this describes how, let's say, a conference can change status, disband, consolidate. Okay, so here's how the policy reads. And what I'm trying to do here is to explain why it is so difficult for change to be initiated. We are a church that is bound by policy. Okay, and here's B75. Process for reviewing status. I'll give you a moment to read this and get a sense of what it is saying here. So clearly it's saying, yeah, I know there might be a reason to change the status of an entity. It might be, they're going bankrupt. They don't have enough money. They don't have enough people. There may be other situations because of which a status needs to be changed. But here's how it happens. A constituency meeting of the entity whose status is under consideration will be necessary in order to discuss the reasons for possible adjustments, so on. Well, that might seem like, yeah, so what, another step, a constituency meeting. In practical terms, that is pretty tough to pull off. And I'll explain to you why. This describes who gets to call a constituency meeting. It's a decision of the executive committee in the higher level of the organization. If it's a conference constituency, the union committee can call that. The conference committee can call that as well. So here's what all of this means. To disband a conference, to consolidate one with another conference by disbanding, you got to schedule a constituency session. Who can do this? Conference can, the union can, the general conference executive can. And then you got to get the item on the agenda. So you need an administrator who takes the initiative to introduce it and an executive committee that is willing to place it on the agenda. Okay, now a church based on the bylaws of a conference, at least in ours, a church could request an item be placed on the agenda, but ultimately the executive committee has authority to either place it or not place it. So the challenge of calling a constituency session, getting it on the agenda, and then informing, educating delegates on why the item is on the agenda and its implications. In Ohio, I believe we had some 300 plus delegates from the various churches. So you have the challenge of informing, educating them why this is an issue and how it can benefit them if this is voted. And then for a major item of this kind, most bylaws require at least 2/3 of delegates voting in favor. So the structure has put into place policies that make it very, very tough to reorganize. Okay, so when we from the outside say, why don't they do it? This is the day who can take the first step. Executive committee, an administrator, a constituency, and 2/3 of the majority of a constituency, right? So we need administrative initiative, we need a constituency action, which require courageous, visionary denominational leaders. We require members who are delegates, who are well enough informed of the governance processes of the church, who are willing to take action. Now, another way this can happen, of course, is financial exigency, as the policy read, right? If a conference cannot financially support itself, that might qualify it to be disbanded, or if membership declines. So in practical terms, the policies have made it extremely difficult for change of this magnitude to happen when we're talking about restructuring the organization. Years ago, a futurist in the Adventist church said that problems generated by a paradigm cannot be solved from within that paradigm. That is the dilemma we are in. Problems generated by a paradigm cannot be resolved from within the paradigm. And the paradigm that we're in has been adopted, has become formal. It has become part of our DNA for generations. And of course, there is security in the familiar ways of doing things. All of this to say that structural change is very, very tough. It's almost been made impossible by the way our forebears organized the church. Here is a second reason that I think this becomes tough. And here I might be treading on some dangerous ground, but I'm going to float the idea and see how it goes. And that is that we have conflated Adventist faith with the Adventist church structure. Now, and the question from which that declaration comes for me is this: what is the church? Is it the congregation, or is it the judicatory, the conference, the union, division, general conference? Which is the church? Now, the theologians in our midst might have some explanations of what it is, but I would be interested in feedback. A few weeks ago, on April 1, actually, it was an All Fools Day, the General Conference in their official Twitter post posted this, and it caught my attention, and so I copied it. It said, "Remember this week that your world church is just as close as your local church family." Notice the terminology. Your world church is just as close as your local church family. Now, you need to decide whether that is true for you. This claim that the world church is close. So let me again go to policy just to make a point here about the terminology we use. This is about tithe. Okay, working policy on tithe. And as you read this, what it is clearly saying is that the world church is the entity that pretty much has the responsibility and the authority to determine the use of tithe. The world church. The world church. This is part of the same policy. V0425, having to do with the central storehouse. So again, I'll let you read this here for a minute. So what this is simply saying is that, the tithe can be collected at the local church or wherever, but ultimately it is this world church, within quotes, that has the responsibility to determine how to distribute tithe. God has entrusted to the world church this responsibility, the world church. So this leads to this question: what is the church? Is it the judicatory? Is it the structure? Or is it the worshiping, learning, serving, witnessing community, the local congregation? What is the church? Which is the church? Now, I'm proposing for us to consider that the denominational offices and ministries are what can be called para-church and not the church. The denominational offices and ministries are what can be called para-church and not church. The term para-church, para coming from the Greek alongside, a para-church by definition and design is an entity that functions alongside the church to provide those ministries that churches cannot fulfill alone. Catch that definition of what a parachurch is. It is an entity that functions alongside the church. Why? To provide functions, services, ministries that the church cannot fulfill alone. And I'm proposing that the conflation of Adventist faith with the Adventist organization has had undesirable outcomes. The conflation of the church with the parachurch, to look at the whole thing as the church, I'm suggesting has had undesirable outcomes. Among them, we have elevated the organization to the level of the sacred. By that, I mean the structure: division, union, general conference, conference. We have felt a certain sacred responsibility to resource it heavily. And we better be careful that we not tamper with it too much. It is sacred. So when you conflate the notion of the church, the worshiping community, with the structure, you end up with some undesirable outcomes. So what do we do? In our own thinking, at least, we could decouple the church from the parachurch. And we could ask the question, if we do decouple the church from the parachurch, we can ask the question, what does the church need that the parachurch can offer us in the third decade of the 21st century? What is that the church needs that it cannot supply for itself, that we need the parachurch? And we probably could end up with some answers to that. And I want to introduce here this theory called the theory of jobs to be done. This comes from Professor Clayton Christensen, who was a professor at the Harvard Business School, wrote a lot about innovation. And he talked about the theory of milkshakes. And so there was a fast food chain that wanted to increase sales of its milkshake. And so they did research, and they said, no, is it, we need to put more chocolate into it? Does it have to be thicker? Does it have to have more syrup? What do we need to do? And finally, whatever they did didn't work, didn't increase sales. So they enlisted a couple of consultants to help them. And these folks showed up at this fast food, this restaurant in the morning, and watched people as they came in and bought their milkshakes. And they found that 60%, I believe, of the milkshakes were bought just around 8 a.m. in the morning. And the people who bought these left with them. You know, they didn't drink the milkshake right there in the restaurant. So they came back the next day, the consultants, the researchers, and they interviewed these people and tried to understand why they were buying these milkshakes. And it turned out that these folk had a commute of about 20, 30 minutes to work every morning. And they wanted something that would occupy them during their drive, that would last about 20, 30 minutes, wouldn't be as messy as eating a donut or a bagel on the road in the car. They were well dressed to go to work. And so the milkshake did a particular job for them. It kept them occupied. It gave them something to do that was enjoyable, gave them some nutrition. And so out of that, and the question they asked was then, what job did you hire the milkshake to do for you? And the job that the milkshake did was it kept them occupied, gave them something enjoyable to do, was not messy, and got them to work. So Professor Clayton Christensen came up with this theory of jobs to be done. Understanding the job for which customers hire a product or service helps innovators more accurately develop products that align with what customers are already trying to accomplish. The theory of jobs to be done. And from there, I asked the question, what are the jobs that we really need the organizational structure to do for the church? If you decouple the two, then this question becomes relevant. What do we need the structure to do? And then, of course, are there alternate ways to get these jobs done? That's a kind of a follow-up question. So my thesis, in part, is that the conflation of Adventist faith with the organization has had undesirable outcomes. And the question for us is, could we adopt a personal paradigm in which Adventist faith and Adventist structure are decoupled, are deconflated? Can we see them as separate entities? And can we assign them appropriate value? And the point I'm making here is that changing our mind about this could change the future. A change of worldview changes the world viewed. Change of worldview about the structure, about the church, could change the outcome in the future. Our perspectives change when we decouple church from parachurch. It gives us a basis to assign value to both of these entities. And it might put us at ease to advocate change in what previously we may have thought to be somewhat untouchable. The church against whom the gates of hell, Jesus said, will not prevail. So as I wrap this up, the Francis Schaeffer question, how then shall we live? How then shall we live? If we have a real passion to try to restructure, as tough as it is, here are some things that I would highlight. Become familiar with governance policies, with constitution bylaws, to understand how change can actually be implemented. Get involved, become active in the governance of your local church and the conference and in other levels. If you have opportunity to have voice in choosing delegates to various committees and constituencies, let your voice be known. And be discerning in your financial support of these two entities, as I see them now, two entities. So if we really are still, hopeful that structural change can happen, getting engaged in these processes is one approach at least. I probably spend more time in the words putting this slide together than any of the others. Answering the question, how then shall we live? Step away from institutional expectations and invest in the experience of lived Adventism through the practices of daily life. This is not saying leave the church. It is saying step away from the expectations that you might feel the church has laid on you, and invest in what is perhaps more important, in the lived experience of Adventism every day. Adventism has given to different ones of us, different tools, different perspectives, different values, and those can be lived out quite apart from what might be happening in the institutional church. So again, how then shall we live? Step away from the expectations, if you can, invest in the lived experience. And then finally, invest in your local congregation if you feel inclined to do that. Within Adventism, the congregation enjoys many elements of autonomy. Despite the structure that exists, the congregation enjoys many elements of autonomy. Congregations decide what kinds of ministries they do. Congregations can decide what kind of resources they would use in their Sabbath schools and wherever. Congregations decide what kind of ministries they will do in their communities. So there is quite a bit of autonomy. And so if you believe that the worshiping, witnessing community is the church, then that's a good place to invest your involvement, your influence, your resources. So that's pretty much, Lauren, what I have for today, and I would be most interested in the discussion.
I'm going to turn it over right now to our moderator, Linda Nottingham. And Linda, I don't see any hands up, but I suspect some will be raised here pretty quickly. Yeah, I will just say, I was in the meeting where my conference president tried to vote the conference out of existence. And the astonishing thing was that he made such a good case for it that the conference committee went along with it. It made perfect sense. And all of us were very much in support of this notion. I will add a little something that I wrote, Raj, on a note in Facebook that ought to, now if you all are listening carefully, this ought to absolutely blow your mind. And that is, in 2015, now that's 8 years ago, in 2015, Monty Salim, who is one of our church's most respected sociologists and who did a lot of church studies for us, did a study where he examined what would happen if we did away with all of the conferences and ran things from the union offices. Now, that seemed to me, as I heard it, perfectly obvious. We do not need local conferences. In my conference, it got to the point at some times where I never asked them for anything other than for my paycheck. I'm an educated pastor. I didn't have to go to Raj and say, what shall I do about building this $5.5 million church? I did it, Raj. And we were very successful. I didn't ask for a lot of advice, didn't need it. So when Monty proposed that, I thought this makes perfect sense. The union can send me my check. If I do need advice, I can call them there. I don't need the local conference. Now, here's the part that I want you to hear, because I want you to hear what this would mean. Monty did a very careful calculation, and he calculated that if the North American division alone, just the NAD, did away with conferences and ran things from the union, even assuming that the union would maybe take on a few extra people in order to do this. Are you ready for this? In 2015, we would have saved $145 million every year. Mm-hmm. Now think about your local church schools and how they're struggling for, $10,000, $20,000. Think about the colleges and how a gift of $10 million would save a college in some cases. $145 million every year would be saved just by a very simple reorganization. And you know how that was received? I was there. I watched it happen. Everybody said, wow, and there was a collective gasp across the North American Division Executive Committee room. And then people started coming up to the microphone and saying, it's a wonderful idea. All of you should do it, except not my conference. Don't touch my conference. But all the rest of you should do that, because it would be nice to have all that money available. It was hilarious. And you'll notice that nothing has happened in 8 years. They have not accepted anything. In fact, in the last 8 years, the North American Division has probably quadrupled in size, the North American Division office itself. It's astonishing. I'm sorry to sound so annoyed, but it just seemed so obvious to me, Raj, that this was something that could be done so easily, would not have affected my local ministry in any way except positively, because money would have been more available to keep our camps going, keep our academies going, keep our schools going. And it seemed so obvious to me, and I couldn't believe how quickly it was shut down. Now, keep in mind that the North American Division Committee is mostly church employees, mostly people who work in those very offices that would have been shut down. So if that gives you any insight, Raj, you're welcome to pitch in on this. You were there too, so you might remember this. Well, no, you weren't at that meeting. You had just...
No, I was not there at that particular meeting, but the study that we did, I think we came up with several $1 million savings just in our conference if we did away with the operation. And our proposal was that all of that money be used in frontline ministry in local congregations. Okay, and so this was savings not just to the structure, but it was savings that was going to go back or remain, ideally remain in the local church. That was the idea.
Linda, are you there? I'm sorry, I jumped right in here because I was so...
No, I'm here. I'm here, absolutely.
So go ahead and take over from here, and Ed Reifsnyder won't be shy.
Well, I'm happy to be with you all today. I apologize, Dr. Attiken, that I was detained just a bit and not on the call when you first began. And I do have just a brief question about that. But first of all, let me just, as I'm sure Lauren already has, welcome all of you. I'm happy just to be sort of run the rodeo a little bit today as we pose our questions related to this very provocative topic. And I think most everybody here is an old hand and knows how to do it, that there is a bar across the bottom where there's an icon for reactions through which you can raise your hand if you'd like to ask Dr. Attiken a question. This is always a very civil group, Dr. Attiken. I know that you know that from your past experience. But my brief question, just for my own clarification, is that when you talked about the structure of the Adventist church, and I think in some regards, at least portions of it had to do with the North American Division, did that include what I believe is a part of the structure that still exists, which are the regions that have to do with Black parallel administrative universes? Was that part of your configuration, or did your illustrations not even include that?
No. When we were talking about conferences, at least in the eastern part of the U.S., there are what used to be called regional conferences, with the largely Black conferences. They're not exclusively Black, of course. There are lots of other groups there. But yes, in this union, we have two conferences, Allegheny East and Allegheny West, which have historically been Black conferences. So I don't believe that such a classification exists in the West Coast, but in the Midwest and here, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Chicago, that I became familiar with it there. So, yeah. Right. Well, you can see the level of interest in this topic, and we're going to begin with Ed. Let's see here. I guess I need to help you unmute.
Linda, I'm helping you with that. So I'm
okay. All right. Well, thank you. All right. Thank you. So Ed, what's on your mind?
Well, very first thing I have to say, those are very cool glasses, Linda.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. They are by necessity. All right.
Yeah, this subject is a bit of a hot button for me, and I've lived out some of it in the church setting in my history. And I just want to make a bald statement that until tithe falls to levels that are unsustainable to maintain the current structure, it will not change. That tithe is the lifeblood of the bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy makes sure that we believe that tithe is a divine obligation, because that supports the continued flow of tithe. And some will be aghast at me saying that, but frankly, I don't believe tithe is a New Testament obligation. It was part and parcel of the Levitical system in ancient Israel. And it has become obligatory, theological, and much guilt is attached to the tithe concept for many people, many members of the church. So until it falls to a level where it will not sustain the bureaucracy will not change. The bureaucracy is not capable of changing unless it's forced to. And I'll list just a few reasons why I think this. Number one, I've mentioned is the tithe theology. Number two is the tithe allocation. It's decided way upstream from you and me how tithe is going to get divided up. And it gets divided up in a way that guarantees the sustenance of all of the entities up and down the bureaucracy outside of the local church. Frankly, they're not too interested in whether or not the local church prospers, just so the tithe money flows into the structure. Second is constituencies. Constituencies are very provincial. Just try to close a failing academy within a conference, and you'll find out how provincial they are. Mm-hmm. It's amazing that Raj got the Ohio conference to vote itself potentially out of business, because they are normally very provincial. Raj, did it actually go to a constituency meeting?
No, the conference executive committee voted to do it, to take it to a constituency, yeah.
It was, Raj, do remember, it was referred up to the union committee and we discussed it there.
Yes, it was, because in order for the plan to work, the other 7 conferences, hopefully all 7 of them, would have to agree to a similar consolidation, right? Because you couldn't do it unilaterally. I mean, you could go out of business, but then what, right? So the idea was that we would consolidate services into one entity. So the union committee received the report, thought there was merit to it, and they recognized that every conference constituency had to vote it. So they sent it to each conference, And of course, Ed, as I said, it was dead on arrival. Right?
Sure. So, Raj, what do you estimate? How many of the 7 constituencies, had it gone as far as constituency meetings, do you think would have voted to approve their conference going out of business?
You know, my belief has been that if people were informed adequately of what the implications were, how the system would work, you know, there is fear of the unknown. So we are talking about a system that we've known for decades. And here come these guys who are talking about something we know nothing about in the future. They're painting a picture that we haven't seen clearly. So there is a lot of fear. How do you educate a constituency of 300-400 people that this would be a good thing to do? So yeah, you know, short of that, the chances of it even clearing a constituency would have been pretty slim.
Yeah, I agree. They're very provincial.
Yeah.
The fourth thing I'll mention is job protection. The conference offices are full of people who are right where they want to be. And they probably don't want to be where they have been, which is where they might have to go if their conference went out of business.
Mhm.
So what we have is a strong career path within the denomination. There's a certain way that people move along their career paths within the denomination, and there's probably strong resistance to that being disrupted and fewer opportunities to move along a peer career path because you've eliminated positions. So that's a factor that works against us. Second, I want to mention what Raj talked about, where the world church thinks it is the world church. When I was a very young man, we started Advent Health in Orlando. And at one time in our history, we had an airplane, which we needed to get to very remote hospitals in Texas and Oklahoma and Kentucky and so forth. And from time to time, we would give church leaders rides on our airplane if we were going somewhere they wanted to go, union presidents or conference presidents. And I was a pretty young man, and I just sat and listened to the conversation on the airplane. And I came to realize that those church leaders, when they talked about the church, they were not talking about my church. They were talking about the bureaucracy. That was their point of reference when they talked about the church, was the structure. Churches are incidental. They're the suppliers of the money that runs the whole thing. And that attitude pervades our denomination at the worker level, I think, or above a certain level, certainly not at the pastor level. And that dictates against a restructuring. In May 2014, Dan Jackson called a big meeting in Dulles, Virginia, across the NAD. Everybody that was anybody in the NAD showed up for this meeting. And they talked frankly about this issue. Everybody gave a pledge that if they could save money and do something better, that they would be willing to give up their job. I'm not seen any of that in the last 9 years. And they came up with this number that was very similar to Monty Celine's number. And the estimates range between 90 million and 140 million of money that could be saved with various restructuring options. And everybody was gung-ho, we're going to go do this. They even put up a website devoted to it for a while. I just looked, it's gone. And nothing ever happened. Even given, let's assume there was goodwill in the room when they were discussing this. But even assuming goodwill on the part of the participants, nothing has happened. So would they do that again and have a different outcome? Probably not. So I'm going to repeat, until tithe falls to levels that will not sustain the current structure, it will not change. I am encouraging you not to pay tithe. You might want to pay an equal amount to your local church or to support the pastors in your conference or something. But that's the only way. If we really want to see structural change in the church, I'm personally jaded that it won't happen short of a financial driver. Sorry to take so long.
Raj, do you want to respond to any of Ed's comments?
Yeah, I concur with Ed that short of a financial exigency, very, very, very unlikely for change to occur. However, the chance of a financial exigency is also very, very slim. I mean, you take the recent history of the church, and some of us expected that during COVID that tithe was going to take a huge plunge. It didn't, right? And I think every year it seems like when the treasurer of the General Conference gives his report, boy, tithe has gone up. No, we're doing pretty well. So yeah, I don't foresee perhaps apart from some political or national calamity, that the tithe, that we're going to have a tithe exigency. So even Ed, if you quit giving your 20 million in tithe a year, that will still be a drop in the bucket, right? Even if all of us on this call, 135 of us, our families, quit, it may not even register on the radar. So I don't know what it'll take as a movement for people to take your counsel, quit paying tithe. I don't know how many people will have to sign on to that altar call before it has some impact.
You just have to work toward a tipping point.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Let me just make one observation. Ed has graciously summarized, I think, what most of us were already thinking in some fashion. And because I see that so many want to be able to participate, I just want to encourage you to keep your remarks brief and move toward a question. And with that, Bjorn, let me come to you. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Raj, for the presentation. I'm a missionary kid. I grew up a missionary kid, and I was the beneficiary, kind of indirectly, of I guess this big structure. And so I get a little defensive when we have these kinds of conversations, because I saw a beauty to the resources that the church provided. I still do. The institutions that I went to, that my dad taught at, my mom taught at, I think provided something very useful to the church. That could be decoupled from the overreach, the GC top-down kind of thing, the top-heavy nature of the GC, the power grabbing, and that we've seen in the last sort of decade and a half. So I am not at all in love with the idea of letting go of the very organized, the over-organized structure of the church and the way we distribute resources, because I feel that they are useful. During COVID, I went to a Sunday church because it was hard for me to go to an Adventist church, and the difference in resources and organization they just were stark. And I missed going to an Adventist church just because of it was higher quality in many ways. So I like the idea of pushing back on GC overreach and keeping that in check, but surely there's got to be a third way. It's not an either or, like let's stop giving tithe and make sure this thing crashes and so we can go congregational completely. Surely there's a way to push back without just giving up on the whole system. I feel like part of the reason that we are so unique in a positive way is that we've stayed together and stayed reasonably organized for so long. So isn't there a way to isn't there a third way? And final thought on this: when the NAD started to reduce the tithe it was giving to the world church, a lot of people, thought that was a great thing, and we showed them for their unwillingness to embrace women's ordination, et cetera, et cetera. But to me, that was a great way for the NAD and progressives in the NAD to lose influence and to lose any sort of way to influence the world church. It was a great way to silence progressives because there was less contribution to the world church in what it gave. So in terms of what the NAD contributed. So I'm looking for a way for progressives to stay part of the big operation, to stay part of the big conversation, and to make an impact that's relevant, rather than let's stop giving and keep bickering from the sidelines. So is there a way for us to do this without just abandoning the whole show?
Well, if you pursue the theory of the jobs well done, or the jobs to be done, then you end up with a model that says, okay, strategically distributing resources for mission, that's a job we want to continue in the system, right? Because we have seen value in the GC being able to strategically distribute resources and institutions, so on. So maybe a model can emerge where we don't need all the layers, but need some way of still continuing that one function and a few other functions. So what I'm saying we ought to envision is a model that arises out of that question. What jobs do we need the structure to provide that the church, the congregation by itself cannot do? Although there are congregations, of course, that do have missionary activity. So I don't have a model beyond, but I think that question can lead to a model that doesn't say, no, let's do away with the whole thing, but let's find ways to still maintain the functions that we value. Does that make sense?
It does. And can I just a quick follow-up question? Do you think, and I brought this up at another ATSS, but do you think that it's almost inevitable in terms of changing generations and anti-establishment attitudes, and I mean, everyone from my generation younger is not in favor of big bureaucracy. Do you think that the problems might solve themselves as people as newer generations take leadership and realize that this top-heavy stuff doesn't work?
Well, I don't know. The kids that I have seen get engaged with last generation theology and such. They tend to be very fundamentalist and very committed to the system. So I would like to believe that what you're suggesting, but I think there are indicators that there is a cohort of young people in the church who see the church the way it used to be 20, 50 years ago and find that perfectly okay. So I don't know. That's what I have noticed.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And thank you, Bjorn. We rely upon you to try and move the needle on the median age here a little lower. So we're glad to hear your perspective. I'm going to come now to my old buddy, Ray Stovall, Ray and Bobby. Ray and I attended what used to be, we called a penal colony known as Keene, Texas, boarding school. Although I think Ray had the advantage of living in the village. But it's good to see you guys. Welcome to you. And what questions do you have for Raj today?
Well, I really like Raj's presentation. And I understand what Bjorn's trying to say about the monies. But for anything to change, I think Raj is going to have to hit the road and do presentations from one end of the country to the other. Because basically what you're talking about, to get change, you've got to re-educate people. You've got to re-educate their thinking. And that's the biggest part of changing people, because we all have that natural resistance to change. So you got to re-educate them on how the change is going to benefit them. And that re-education process has to come across as benefiting the local churches. You get the local churches on board with the changes. I mean, you're going to have pastors coming out of the woods because they are so poor that they can't do much with their local churches. I've heard many a pastor say, we don't have the money. We don't have the money. It's all gone upstairs. I can only get so much money out of my local congregation. So it's a frustrating thing. But through the re-education process of downsizing, and downsizing is nothing new. All of society has been downsizing for a long time. So, Raj, you got a big job ahead of you. We might have to start sending you around the world with your message here.
And you just thought you had retired.
Well, I will need Ed's private jet to get around if Ed is still flying it around. Yeah, I hear you, Bobby. Ray. Even when you are talking about a constituency session in a conference, the challenge is informing, educating 300, 400 delegates to see value in what you're proposing. Even within one conference, that's a huge challenge, leave alone the larger territory. But I agree with you, education, information is key.
Well, you got to re-educate, I think, at the church level, because constituent meetings are so pre-programmed, they're worthless. They're only for a certain agenda and predetermined. So to me, that's at the wrong place. It's got to start at the local level. You got to get the local pastor and their congregation on board. I mean, it seems like a hopeless task, but maybe somewhere someone can start that. But it isn't going to change without education. And it means a 180 in the way we have run things.
Yeah, agree. I agree.
Well, and Raj, to piggyback onto Ray's question, you mentioned in your presentation that over the last 40 years, there had been calls for restructuring. And I found myself wondering, from whom? Where did those calls come from?
Yeah, well, I've been aware of this individual voices, but the more concrete, the most recent one that came to memory was this letter. And Lauren, you read the letter that came to Adventist Today after your last magazine was printed. And I won't mention the person's name, but she claimed that her father was a pastor who retired in 1992, and who at that time had written letters to the union, to the division, to the pastors in this conference, saying pretty much some of the same stuff that I've been saying now. See, calling for restructuring. So, yeah, there have been some definite calls by individuals. I don't have a record of all of them, but this matter has been percolating for a long time, in some circles at least.
All right, thank you very much. Carolyn, we come to you. We're glad you're joining the conversation. What are your questions and comments for Raj this afternoon?
I pretty much come to endorse what Ed has to say. I think we have it all wrong, that the tithe goes up high. The tithes should mainly stay with the local congregation. The benefits my church gets from tithe is the pastor's salary. And there's nothing for a mission. The mission of this church is to take the message to all the world. And the best evangelizers are the local churches who have a wonderful presence in their community of doing good things. And if the money goes there, I think we'd see an increase in our membership. End of speech.
Thank you, Raj.
Well, the tithe is very interesting the way it works. The local church sends it to the conference. and then the conference sends a portion of it, about 35% or so, depending on various factors, to the union, and that goes to the division. And then a piece of it comes back. It comes back, they call it restricted, meaning you can only use it for what the General Conference says you can use it. And then there's also tithe exchange, where there are some things that you're not supposed to use tithe for. So you send tithe money, and then they send you back money that is not sacred, right? It is non-tithe funds that you can buy stuff with. But when it's all said and done, our calculation in Ohio was that about 30 cents out of every dollar goes to support pastors' salaries and benefits. So, typically we say the tithe supports the pastors. In actuality, only about a third of the tithe dollar goes to support the pastor's salary and benefits.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. George, what are your thoughts for us this afternoon? It's your turn.
Good morning, good afternoon. I hope my audio is okay. Is it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. For how many years have we been waiting for changes? Some of us here probably are waiting for 60, 70, maybe 80 years for changes. Many changes have been proposed. How many have been actualized? So I'm very skeptical of this. I actually quit because I'm hoping for a change, because it's not going to happen. I worked for a career as a psychologist, and one thing that I always kept in mind was, don't try to help someone who's not asking help or rejecting help. So today, Raj, your presentation was great. I appreciate the discussion. But guess what? The president of the GC will just tell you, thank you for your offer, and that's it. Nothing is going to happen. So I think that we need to be realistic, because these changes are not going to happen. The structure is not going to happen. The remnant church is solidly established. So my question will be only one.
George, do you have more than? Do you have more?
What makes you think that there is change possible?
George, we're losing your signal. We can't hear very much, but I think we did get your point. But you are having a breakup in your audio. We couldn't hear you all the time. Does for that.
So George, yeah, I am skeptical too, and that is why I said, if you feel passionately about this change, get engaged and try to spur it on, but take care of yourself, your own faith development within Adventism. Don't hold your breath about structural change. Perhaps the more important thing is that your faith matures in Christ, that you benefit from the Adventist faith that you have received and nurture it along. And there are ways you can do that regardless of what happens to the structure. And also your involvement with the local congregation. Regardless of what happens to the structure, you can be engaged in the local congregation. So that's why I included those two elements, because while we wish for change and talk about it, I think all of us recognize that is a long road, if at all we travel that road. Your point is well taken, though, George.
Alvin, we don't see you, but we come to you. You're next in the queue. Welcome to you. Tell us what is on your mind today.
Thank you. I'm okay. I'll try and put in my Okay, that's fine. Good evening. I'm using my phone here. Yeah, okay, let me do this. Yeah, good evening. Thanks, Raj, for the presentation. I just want to say a few things and then that will be it. I think George Knight has been writing about it, and George Knight should be a respected authority in the Adventist Church about this structure. I mean, he has been complaining for years that the structure is too massive. And his premise was, or has always been, the mission must influence the structure. So what is the mission of the church, and what structure do we need to do a mission? But of course, no one has listened to him because nothing has changed. The second issue I wanted to just mention is, I think it is said only about 30% of members, depending on, I think on average globally, actually return a tithe. So it's not like everybody's tithing. It's about 30%, I think, of the members return a tithe. The other issue I also want to just highlight is that, like all organizations, strategy and restructuring is driven by the CEO. Those of us who have worked in organizations who still do know that the CEO drives restructuring. And I don't see appetite in the current CEO to even think about it. Because as Raj said, there is a perception that the structure is sacred. Don't touch it, it's sacred. And we're all told that as members. We grow up being told that the structure is sacred. So yeah, when I say, so sorry, Ed, when I say CEO, I mean yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, so unless we get basically disabused of the concept of the thinking, as Raj said, that the structure is sacred. The structure is a vehicle to support, to provide services to the church. It's not the church. And so that's where we are now. The other question I just have, and maybe those in the NAD can help me. I'm in South Africa, so in the NAD, the division has a certain position because you're one country. Okay, you and Canada, I think. In other parts of the world, our division really doesn't play a role. And so it might be a place we can say the divisions. Actually, I don't know what they do, because it's redundant. It just duplicates what we can get from the General Conference directly or from the unions. Then the last point I want to also mention is that unions can be quite important. I think in NAD you might not pick it up because, for example, your unions. A union in most of, okay, let me talk about Lake Union. I think that's one I know best. Lake Union. It's inside North America. So, but in other parts of the world, a union is actually the national office. For example, in South Africa, you might have Southern Africa Union Conference, and that is the national office. That is the office which relates to the state, to the government. In NAD, it's not as clear because you have many unions within one political territory. So unions might be important to keep. Divisions can go, in my opinion. Conferences can be merged or downsized. But I think unions might play a role globally in many parts of the world. Thank you, Raj, and everybody.
Yeah, I agree with you, Alvin. I think the unions can play an important role. The model that we proposed was that the union remain and the conferences dissolve and form and have services offered by the union. And the division really is not another level in the structure, although it appears that way in the organization. The division technically is a division of the General Conference. And so the division and the General Conference are one. The General Conference operating in North America is the North American division. I also agree with you that a leader, you call it CEO, but the president of the structure plays a key role some of us, I think Lauren put something on the chat here. Some of us were encouraged when Elder Dan Jackson initiated this study and conversation about restructuring in North America. And it looked like it was going to get some traction. And like Ed said, they have even a website posted, but then it fizzled out. And what actually happened was the North American division expanded, built a new structure, and so it went the opposite direction. Here we were thinking it's going to downsize and flatten the organization. Instead, we ended up with a bigger building, a newer building outside of the General Conference. They didn't want to be under the same roof. So, but I agree that a leader plays the key role in any potential flattening of the organization or downsizing.
Let me,
before I
interrupt here for just a moment, Linda, and say that I'm trying to bring in a couple of questions from the chat too. And Lisa Samelpanger from Finland pointed out something, Raj, that I didn't know until a few years ago. And that is that there are a lot of places in the world that don't have conferences. They only have what they call a union of churches. Mm-hmm. And that works very well. So they basically bypass the conference structure entirely. And I wanted to make sure that Lisa doesn't speak up here very often. She has some hearing problems. And I wanted to make sure that we got her comment in here because it's an important one. Sorry about that, Linda.
No problem. But I wanted to just pick up, before I go to Shelley, I wanted to pick up and dig just a little deeper on comments between Alvin and Raj having to do with the lack of appetite for change, perhaps at the higher levels of the institutional church. And Raj, you perhaps you're breathing a sigh of relief. You made yourself a bit vulnerable to us in your presentation by throwing out the question or the idea of whether or not we should consider the fact that in some quarters, the church itself is conflated with church structure. Nobody's pressed you about that just yet, but I think I will just for a moment, because if your hypothesis is true, and Alvin sort of intimated that in his remark, would you suggest that that is just something coincidental, or has that been intentional?
I'm not a historian, but it seems to me that we kind of evolved that way right from the beginning. I don't know whether there was an intentional conversation about two entities becoming one or what is what, but our definition of the church and the denomination kind of came together right from the beginning, it seems to me, and so we grew up that way, and of course the structure expanded, and as the church grew and so on. But as we think about it now, as I think about it now, in my mind, I can make the distinction between church, the body of Christ, the worshiping, serving, witnessing community. That's where people are welcomed into the body. That's where you're baptized in a sense, etc. And I can make the distinction between that and an organizational structure that exists to provide some services that the congregation cannot provide for itself. So when I cannot think of, as I say, I'm not a historian, I cannot think of any particular time where there was some intentional conversation about this and a merging happens. It seems that we grew up that way. And so at this point, we're trying to sort out, at least I'm trying to sort out, how did that happen, or what do we do with the fact that it has happened? I don't know whether that's helpful, Linda, but that's, and maybe there's somebody who knows the story much better than I do, who can help us sort that out.
Well, I imagine that we all suspect that your hypothesis is true. Perhaps that's a subject for another day, but thank you. Thank you for that. And let me come to Shelley. Welcome. I always enjoy seeing the things that you post. And Adventist today, I'm interested to hear your comments this afternoon. It's afternoon where I am anyway.
Yeah. No, I'm really glad to be kind of at this position in the questions and comments, because several of the things that people have said really resonate to my main concern, which is I think that in the intense structuring of our church, we've definitely lost a responsiveness and a respect to the needs of different regions. And the needs and the fact that some people are saying, well, let's get rid of the conference. Some people are saying, well, the divisions could go. Other people, the unions need to go. And I think that has become one of the issues. And to me, I think that one of the ways we could really address the problems of how evangelism became colonialism and how the church has been unresponsive in many ways. I think specifically of women's ordination. We are told that the world church is, that we're the world church and the world church is as close as our local church building. But when some regions of our entity said, our culture and our reality would be so greatly blessed by an equal and full ministry of women, for instance, we were told that the world church could not endure that. And yet we are supposed to be sacrificing and accommodating and understanding about other issues and needs that the world church faces. And I'm not saying that there should be an exclusion, but I think that part of the problem in the responsiveness to our needs and issues is the fact that we're so entrenched. For instance, in terms of, I would be hopping on board, let's get rid of the unions, because I have been in a situation where I lived in Wyoming, and to all those Colorado folks I see out there, during the 80s when Wyoming was making a lot of gas money, that's when you absorbed the Wyoming conference into the Rocky Mountain Conference. Interestingly enough, because there was all this discussion about how it happens when there's deficit and need. Sometimes consolidation happened because we were financially advantageous. So it's always interesting to think about that. And then, of course, the oil industry busted and Wyoming was not necessarily a helpful thing. But I really think that the whole idea of education and discussion and sharing what our realities are. I was so thrilled that Lisa made the mention of how their church is structured and how that they've given it a whole nother name. And so talking about words and terms and labels is one of the discussions I think would really help us just to begin with, which leads me to my question. And I'm so appreciative that we're dealing with this today. And that specifically is, my whole view of this has changed a lot since I started working with the hospital foundation here at our little rural church on the far coast of Washington State. And when Raj mentioned the idea of parachurch and the idea of separate entities that deal with separate issues, I know that our hospital foundation deals with the giving, the recruiting of funds. We're the ones, for instance, while a bond measure is being promoted, we can go out and do the discussion that it's not possible or appropriate, for our local hospital entity to do. And so aside from, I think, an honest communication of what regions really need and what type of leadership helps them, whether conferences are more responsive. When women's ministry got the thumbs down at 2015, conferences around mine here, some of them backpedaled on the women's ordination issue. And others, such as my particular conference, stood firm and got a little chastising. And so I like conferences a lot, and divisions and unions, rather, I'm not so sure. We have a big building I drive by every day. Every time I drive into Portland, that reminds me of where some of the funds in unions go. So what would be the possibility of a foundation format, certainly more conversation, but supporting that parachurch idea as being one of the solutions for, instead of having to rebaptize our funds in a tithe exchange, you know, being able to have a separate entity that says, what are the real needs, where leaders can communicate on that. And that's one of my questions, whether that's something to explore.
Yeah, you know, the entities, conferences, maybe not be all of them, unions, divisions have a function of fundraising apart from the tithe stream, and some of them do pretty well in raising funds. I know in our conference, you know, we used to raise funds for the campsite and this and that, and those funds were not mingled with tithe; they were restricted funds. So that happens. And so if we went to a purely donation-based model with a foundation, I suppose a foundation could raise money to support the structure at some level, may not be the current level, but that might be a stream of income if people feel there's value in giving to the foundation to support a structure, they would do that. So, yeah.
I mean, we have, you know, now at the GC level, of course, we have ministry department, we have an education department, which is a larger format of what breaks down in our conferences and unions. But I think it would be interesting, you know, in some ways, you know, Adventist Health has become its own entity, you know, for sure. But we still take offerings for them, you know, or for their specific entities within that. I don't know. I just think that, again, you're right, more conversation and more, you know, heart changes and discussions for sure. But I appreciate this topic a lot, and I'm really glad that this got to be one of our seminars. So thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Bob, we've come to you. Share with us what you'd like to add to the conversation today.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Raj. Really enjoyed your rather informative presentation. Now, I think it was Frederick Douglass who said something to the effect that power concedes nothing without a fight. And that's why we have revolutions, and that's why we had a civil war. So I'm not optimistic that, even though it's quite necessary, I fully agree with Ed's presentation. I'm not optimistic that the institution will self-reform. And I think the institution itself took care of that by conflating spirituality, religiosity, theology, all of that. They conflate those elements into tithing, right? And it is a fact that they do not, the conference enough, they really don't care about the local church. When I, in my brick and mortar, we send about $1.9 million to the conference. And yet we struggle for our own local expenses. Why? Because members conflate the state of their spiritual development with tithing, and the leftovers they would give to the church. Meanwhile, the conference does not support us in any way whatsoever. When I was the auditor for the church, when the conference guys came, they only came to audit. They only came to check to ensure that they got their due. They did not express any interest in our own development or our own structure or effectiveness in what we do. So we understand that. I don't expect them to give that up. Now, I wanted to touch on the issue of the regional conferences. Again, in my region, there are two conferences. Both conferences overlap in the exact geographic area. And they're part of the regional conference system. it turned out that in general, one conference was Black and the other conference was white. As a result of the dynamics of evangelism, and the demographics in the city, the white conference was losing members. And what they did, however it happened, a number of Black churches joined the white conference. So it has even made it more spurious, because the traditional quote unquote white conference now hosts many Black churches. Now, this is my question. It has been said, and this speaks to the regional conference and also at the local level, it has been said that the reason and the rationale, the reason that for the regional conferences in the Black ministry supposedly was that Ellen White supposedly said that Blacks ministering to Blacks will be more effective in light of the Civil War and slavery and Jim Crow and everything else. And supposedly that was the rationale for the Black conferences, regional conferences, even within the same geographic area. I wanted to know, one, whether there's any merit to that, or whether it's even valid, right? And secondly, there were efforts to consolidate these two conferences. And my understanding, I was pretty young at the time, my understanding was that there was infighting and squabbles over whether or not it would be a white treasurer or a Black treasurer, because they wanted, remember in Yugoslav's government, they took turns on the presidency. So in that effort, my understanding was that they wanted to, the executive secretary would be Spanish, the president would be Black, but my understanding was that they insisted that the treasurer, just controlling the money, will be white. And supposedly there was a breakdown in that effort. I don't know whether or not there was any thoughtfulness to this. And my final point is that it has also been said as a rationale for the regional conferences that, and this part is true, it is probably the only vehicle that would provide power, prestige, and influence within the religion to Black members. Otherwise, if it did not exist through racism, benign neglect, and that type of thing, they probably would not have any office of consequence. And by the way, that will also serve as reason for why the Blacks would insist on maintaining the regional conferences set up and the overlapping things. So do you give merit to any of these? Is there any merit to any of this? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I don't see myself an expert in some of this stuff. Even if there is merit, Bob, and the notion that Blacks can benefit the Blacks the best, it's quite a leap from that to the notion of needing regional conferences to do that, right? You could have a conference, don't call it white or Black, you could have a conference with congregations that are largely one or the other or a mix of all of that. So that's one thing. The other, we had in the Columbia Union, Dr. Harold Lee, a Black pastor who was the president of the union. The Columbia Union would not classify itself as a Black union necessarily or regional, but right now we have a division president who is Black. So I think we may have moved beyond the time when you needed a regional conference for Black people to hold office, to, within quotes, advance and so on. I think that scenario is changing, in my opinion, and we certainly have leaders in conferences and unions from various ethnic, racial backgrounds anymore. And yeah, that's what I noticed. Again, I'm not an expert in how all of that works, but I would think that the notion that Hispanics can minister best to Hispanics doesn't by itself argue in favor of establishing Hispanic conferences, right? It can happen, those kinds of ministries can happen within any conference. So that's where I would be, just speaking off the top of my head right now.
Yes, by the way, I just want to note something along those lines. In the Northeastern Conference, I remember when I came as a youngster, it was African American and the Caribbeanites, ministers from the Caribbean and elsewhere, who came to the New York region. They really could not get a job. They were, they were not welcomed. Now, with time and demographics and immigration, the conference is totally Caribbean-led. And one of the big problems here is that there are effectively the church cannot, well, the church in this era does not appeal to African Americans, and we have none. And they see it as a big challenge, a big problem. Whatever, through history or whatever, Caribbean, African American dichotomy, we do not have African Americans in our midst, and that's a big challenge. And yet they are here. The numbers are here, but Adventism is not. Well, I don't know how to put it. They're just not. The conference is Caribbean driven. Most of the membership were from the Caribbean, and we do not. I don't think there's any directed outreach to African Americans, and we don't have them in our midst.
Yeah. Thank you.
We appreciate it very much. Ishmael, we come to you. Welcome. We're glad you're here with us. What are your comments this afternoon? Ishmael, I know that you're unmuted. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Once again, just want to thank AT for facilitating the space, and thank you, Brother Raj, for your presentation. My question is in regards to, do you know of any current or maybe previous comparative analysis between our church structure and other denominational structures to kind of see what other churches or denominations have done in order to ensure that there is appropriate, efficient administration, while at the same time making sure that mission can be done effectively, and that, as one person stated, the structure can serve to facilitate mission rather than vice versa.
Well, I have not done a comparative study, Ishmael, and I'm aware of different models of organization that exist. I've had some significant contact with Methodist pastors, and every system has its pros and cons. And in the Methodist system, you have the local church determining every year what the pastor is going to be paid. and the district superintendent shows up and kind of oversees the process. And that's a highly tense period for these pastors, because they're at the mercy of the congregation. So they would see, at least the pastors I've had contact with in the Methodist system, they would see that as a weakness, and they admire the Adventist system in that particular regard. But they feel like you don't have to play into the whims of the local congregation. So, but I have not, to answer your question specifically, I have not done comparative studies on how structures have evolved and changed over time in the various denominations. In the Roman Catholic system, of course, we know the hierarchy is still the hierarchy. So yeah, that would be an interesting comparison to make and see whether there have been changes and how those changes have taken place.
Thank you very much. Enoch, we come to you. We're glad you're here. What is on your mind for our conversation today?
Thank you. One of the points I like to make is that the pastorate level of influence in the church seems to have taken a step down as opposed to administrative positions. And I don't know how that can be solved. Like the previous speaker said, asked pretty much the same question, how different churches deal with this kind of an issue. Well, what I see in many instances is pastors wanting to go to a large church where their wives can find a job of their own apart from the church work, or maybe within the church work itself. They don't want to go to small churches. And when I look at some things that are happening to the country that I come from, in India, the guys come out of college, they are inadequately trained, so they go back to school so that they can get a secretary job. This kind of attraction is something that's contrived. It's made by us. For instance, they try to get the wife of a pastor to become a church worker. And therefore, that restricts that pastor's freedom, because they know which side of the bread, the butter is put. That's one point. The other one I wanted to say, we talk so much about tithe and all that, but how we use it. We have all these different leaders with from all these divisions. How many times a year do they come to the United States? They fly over. When the world businesses are operating with so many things done on computers, with the Zoom age, particularly God has blessed us with COVID by showing us that there are better and more economical ways. And yet we do not want to change. We want to bring all these people over. So these are kind of things, maybe that's just a few pennies in the dollar, but still, we don't put many pennies into evangelism. I heard that only 2% of tithe is being used for evangelism by our church. That is the parachurch. The one thing I noted, Bjorn said that some of these things need to be kept. I didn't hear that there should be no parachurch from what Raj said. We just need to trim it. Thank you.
Raj, did you want to weigh in on that at all?
Yeah, I think that's the point I was trying to make too, that the parachurch has a function. What is in question is whether we need the whole works to do for us what we feel is needed in our time. And I agree that anymore, this idea of people coming together from all over the world for spring council and fall council and all of that doesn't make a lot of sense anymore with all the technology that we have.
Well said. Thank you. Doug, we're glad to see you today. Give us your thoughts this afternoon.
Thank you. And Raj, when I lived in Wisconsin, we benefited from your innovation conferences, and I appreciate those still to this day. I still have some of the recordings. So there's a couple of things that come to mind as we talk about this. Number one is I still tithe, but I don't tithe to the conference anymore through our local church, which actually in my case, living in Oregon, I'm actually a member down in Southern California for very specific reasons. But I like the way that pastors are paid for exactly the reasons that you talked about, Raj, in contrast to Methodism. It's a much fairer system in which the influence of the congregation on what the pastor preaches or espouses, I think, is our system is much better. And so I feel very torn to have made that decision, more than 10 years ago now. In contrast to that, I actually provide contributions to local paid personnel that are not pastoral. And the congregation where I was a member until recently permitted that and actually used those funds for music ministry and other things. And I think that's something that, to the extent that local congregations can actually facilitate that, to me is a wonderful thing, because it's not just the pastor that is ministering. And I think we all know that. And here we're paying for the janitor at the conference office, but we can't pay the janitor at the local church. We have to get volunteers. In that specific regard, I think that one of the questions I would have for you, Raj, and I don't know the answer to this, is to what extent is the conference open and allowed to subcontract out back office functions? And I'm from banking at one point, and we contracted out some back office functions in the financial institution that we were at because other organizations could do those back office functions very efficiently. So can a conference contract out payroll, treasury, whatever else? And finally, I used to live in Douglas County, Oregon. There were 7 churches there. It had nothing to do with Revelation. But the interesting conclusion that I came to is that all of those little churches all suffered from something very common, is that the pastor was needed to do everything, to be the administrative pastor, to be the counselor, to be the preacher, to be the ministerial leader of the church. And I wondered, horrors, whether a diocese model might actually work. I know we'd never want to call it that, but the idea would be let's take Douglas County, 7 churches. There would be a pastor that was primarily assigned to do counseling. We needed people to do counseling because we had members as well as non-members that needed counseling and could not afford to go to a paid counselor or psychiatrist or psychologist. We needed a pastor that would just deal with the ministry of the physical structures, deal with the air conditioning. We had an air conditioning and security system at the church that I was at that was well beyond what an ordinary church had. It had inherited that with the structure, and it needed somebody who knew how to run that kind of system and make sure that it worked well. And so I see this opportunity to, first of all, forget about the big bang theory, because I don't think we're ever going to get there, but to see at the local level, individual members like me deciding where to put my money locally, the congregation deciding to where to, well, maybe groups of churches deciding to figure out what kind of services that diocese needs and ask for pastors that are good at counseling and a pastor that's good at preaching, and a pastor that's good at administry. And then maybe if things actually got radical, that idea would float up to the conference level that says, okay, we're gonna farm out our payroll system to, I don't know, the union, or we're gonna farm out whatever other back office functions. Anyway, those are my thoughts and my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. I'm glad the Innovation Conference was of some value to you. After hearing your question, it's very possible that there will be a new policy voted somewhere here pretty soon that says you cannot outsource treasury from a council. As far as I know, right now, there are no policies that keep us from outsourcing. Why we haven't done it, I don't know. But I don't believe, I could be wrong, I don't believe there are policies that say a conference could not outsource a ministry function. Okay, so that's my knowledge level right now. And congregations do have some autonomy to kind of provide for that kind of funding where members can give to specific functions and have them distributed that way. We toyed with an idea that you might find interesting. In a pastoral search process, we said, what would happen if we included somebody from the mayor's office in the city, or somebody from some council that deals with the needs of the city in the search process, so that right from the get-go, the pastor gets the sense that he has some privileges in the parish which extends beyond the church. Okay, and this may not relate to your question, but the idea of sharing services among multiple churches or in a community that has some merit. But in terms of the outsourcing, again, I don't know why we never thought of that. I'm not aware of any policy that would prohibit that, as long as the auditors who come from the General Conference are able to do their audits without any roadblocks. And whether that would have cost us less, I don't know. In terms of hiring a treasurer versus outsourcing the function, I haven't priced it out, so I don't know. You folk might have more knowledge about that. Thank you for your comments.
Yes, absolutely. Lauren, we come to you. I'll let you unmute yourself.
Yes. Yeah, okay. I'm going to go. I guess I'll just go ahead of Florin here, if you don't mind. Linda is so kind to try to keep us all in order. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions, Raj, that came up and a comment. One is that I'm not sure that I agree that the idea of paying all pastors the same amount of money has actually worked that well for us. I was very happy that I got a full salary when I was a pastor in a small district. But on the other hand, what's also happened is that nearly every pastor I know is aspiring not to be a pastor of a bigger church because he's going to get the same amount of money. He's aspiring to go to a conference office or a union office or a division office or the GC. And I can count on one hand the pastors I've known in my life who got that kind of call that didn't take them. It has been defined in Adventism that you are not a success until you leave pastoral ministry. Every pastor that I know realizes that and thinks that. And so we have this constant drain of good pastors. If you're a good pastor, you're going to get a call into a conference office. And there you have a much nicer job. You're surrounded by nice people who like you. You don't have all of you annoying church members who are complaining and whining and and criticizing. You get a nicer travel budget, a little bit more money, not a lot, but a little bit more. They buy your computer for you and all of the things that you need. You get to travel around a lot. It's a nicer job, Raj. I hate to tell you, but you had a better job. And yeah, you get complained to once in a while, but then you go back to your nice office and everybody likes you there. And they say, yeah, it's not your fault, Raj. You did fine. And while I have to stand up at the pulpit and preach to the people who made my life so miserable that week, yeah, it's a little bit weird that way. And I think we need to change that part of the equation very much. And you can jump in here and tell me I'm all wet, but I think I'm right.
Yeah, in terms of the money itself, Lauren, if I remember right, I think I got 4% more than you did. It was not a huge differential between a conference president and a pastor. But yes, there were other perks, travel and all that. The gentleman who hired me, who invited me to join the conference office, at one point at some meeting, somebody asked them the same question that you did. How come you guys hiring good pastors? And he said, what would you rather have us do? You want us to hire the bad pastors into the conference office? So it's almost natural that if you're in the hiring process, you want to hire good people, no matter where they are. And from a pastor's perspective, yes, I think I agree with you that there is definitely an attraction to get an office job that has some perks and doesn't have some of the liabilities within quotes that accompany a pastor's job. So, yeah, that's how I see it.
Well, I might just add on to that the same dysfunction occurs in education. The qualities that make someone a fine teacher are not the qualities that make someone a good site administrator necessarily. And so we see the same thing happening there. Good teachers aspire to move into administration because they make a lot more money.
Let me ask you one more question, Raj, before I let Florin come in here. And that is, if somebody said to you when you're conference president, I want to support my local pastor, and I don't mind supporting the local conference and the things that you do. I just don't want any of my money to go to the union, the division, the general conference. Is there a way to do that? Could somebody send you their money and said, yeah, put this in the pastoral fund, but don't send any of it on?
I think there's a way to do that if it did not come in a tithe envelope marked tithe.
Okay.
Right?
You heard it here. Don't use the word tithe.
Because if you send it as tithe, the conferences are required to book it that way and then send it on and be audited and so on. You might remember this. There was a group that was getting started in a suburb of Cleveland, and they came to us and said, listen, we know we don't qualify for a pastor. They're not large enough. You guys don't have the budget, blah, blah. Could we keep our tithe and pay the pastor as we get started? And it made sense to us because they were right. We couldn't provide them a pastor. And we said, yeah, do it. There was another church, a Korean church that was starting in the Dayton area. And they said, listen, in our culture, unless we have an ordained pastor, we are not a church. We cannot grow. We cannot attract people. We need an ordained pastor, and we're just starting here. We don't have the resources. Could we, if we send you the tithe, we don't have the resources. Could we keep our tithe and hire our own pastor? It made sense to us, and we said, yeah, do it. Today, it's a large church here in Dayton with a thriving congregation. So, yeah, there are things you could do. if you're willing to stretch a little and take some risks. And the one thing, Lauren, about that, and you might remember some of this, if you have a committee, an executive committee that approves these exceptions to policy, as it were, the auditors will come, they'll write you up that you violated policy. They will read the report at the constituency session when you are going to be reelected or not. But if your committee has approved it, then it's not just you. No, they're standing with you, and it goes okay. So the answer is yes, there are ways to get it done if you want to get it done.
Never use the line on the envelope that says tithe. never use that. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Florin, I took so long, and it is your term.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Raj, for your presentation. And I'm glad that this meeting is recorded, because a lot of good things were said, and I don't have the capacity to retain everything. However, I do consider this as being a present truth for our situation. It's something that we deal for at the present time. So, and I have a few comments and a question for you. A few of the ideas were already mentioned, so I'm not going to spend time repeating them. But the solution is not very simple, and the debate may collect a hybrid solution. May not be just one level affected. Like we heard, the needs are different in a different geographical location, so the change may be adjusted as needed. Looking into the history, the actual structure of the conference union, where it was established when many years ago, when the pastor needed to go and receive their salaries being paid the money there. So they will be also informed and updated with the last news. These times are gone. We have paycheck payrolls. There are only few news that will come directly for the conference that interest anybody. If something happened into Adventism, and I want to know about that, I'm not looking to the conference or the union for that. I go to Adventist Today or Spectrum, and there I got the news. Whatever happens didn't come from that way. These days, with software and intelligence, artificial intelligence, those jobs traditionally can be overperformed compare with and cheaper compare with any kind of structure. Why Walmart or many stores consider and implemented the self-check out cashiers. So maybe this would be a concept. For me, this is a concept. The church needs to take this self-check-out mode, a direction toward to go. And may be useful for the constituency to learn that if and when the restructuring phase may come into the church, the actual leadership not continuing into the office may be given the opportunity to work directly in the field. So many fear for their jobs, but I think there are a lot of needs to be filled up to that. Actually, many of you mentioned that the education of the people is a big deal and crucial for any change. Yes, but one enemy in this process is the, and I like to use the proper word, maybe I'll use it, is the brainwash idea that the faithfulness and is an unconditional obedience to the God and his church. And if we refer that the highest authority in the church is the GC in the session, and the people never being part of the nominating committee to confirm or to not agree that, those people will never see what many of this group sees today as a huge barrier for spiritual growth and development. And I will, before the question, I will end with telling you something. About 20 years ago, when I worked in Illinois conference, I wanted to do I wanted to do a survey, and I made I wanted to see how educated, how knowledgeable is the church. And I made a piece of paper, and I asked the question, who was the first president of the Seventh-day Adventist Church? Who is the actual president, secretary, treasurer? Who is the president of the union? Who is the president of the conference? I was into the Central Illinois Conference, and I'll give you I don't know if you will be surprised or not. 80% of every question related former first president, actual president of GC, union, or conference, 80% of the answer was one name, and that was Denny Shelton, because the people were close to 3ABN. I have to realize that half of our members, they even don't know the name of the local president conference. If you believe I'm wrong, check and ask them who is the president of the local conference, and you'll figure out that half of them, they have no clue who is that person and where is that person and when does what he does, or she. Question. So I can say more, but I'm ending here. So question, Raj, do you think that would be a benefit for the church that in this future reorganization maybe included, maybe adjusted the form of leadership election? Well, it would not be much transparent, and if several individuals will run for that offices, and ultimately people will know them, and they will be kept accountable according with the vision, promises, and performance. Because I see that coming as a package. The actual structures coming to the way of we nominated the people, but would be more transparent for one to say, I would like to be the union president, or whatever name is it. I like to be president, and this is what I think, this is my vision, and this is what I offer. Do you think that would benefit the church?
So if I hear you right, Florian, you're talking about different candidates presenting themselves and making
Correct.
their case, campaigning.
Yes. I'll comment. I was not long ago, I was part of the conference nominating committee, and I noticed that whatever the people may have in mind and try to suggest was worthless, because the things how to do were planned a long time ahead. So it's no purpose to bring 400 people there to pray for the presence of the Holy Spirit, when if you were there, you realize that it's an offense to the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, I see. I understand that, sometimes these things are cooked ahead of time in closed doors, and the committee process is really a formality that members don't have much of a choice. I don't know. I'm just trying to envision what a campaign season would look like for a conference president to go around to churches. Not only a conference, for people. I don't know in what forum they would campaign, but it's an interesting notion that more than a small nominating committee be permitted to have input in the process. And even with the nominating committee, there still are some restrictions depending on who's chairing it and the culture of the place. So yeah, I don't know what it'll look like, but it's certainly an interesting idea.
Can be done on Zoom.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.